welcome, my friend, to the Minnesota Gardening Podcast. My name is Brad Tabke, and it is my absolute honor to have you here with us today. And we are talking about dormant seeding today. So we have the incredible James Wolfin from Metro Blooms with us here today. He specializes primarily in bee lawns, so pollinator lawns and being in that type of arena. But also we talk about establishing prairie gardens with pollinators and lawn, turf seeding and that kind of thing. So it's a really great episode and super, super timely. And right now in Minnesota is the best time in mid-November for doing dormant seeding, and best is right before a snowfall. So you will be able to be prepared and ready to roll to get dormant seeding done on your landscape. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any other timely content. So you can subscribe to the podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. Just search for minnesotagardening.com, and you can see all the links and information that James and I discuss in the show notes for this episode at minnesotagardening.com/9. So one last note. When I went to edit this podcast episode, my audio was just totally foobar. It was really, really messed up. So I have gone through and re-asked the questions that I had asked James during the podcast interview. And so it'll be a little bit weird, but I think that you'll get the picture. So please excuse that issue. So here we go. All right, today we have with us James Wolfin, who is the Director of Education and the Blue Thumb Partnership at Metro Blooms, and he's just an awesome guy. So thank you so much, James, for being with us.
Yeah, excited to have the opportunity to talk about the great work that Metro Blooms and Blue Thumb does. So I guess broadly, the goal of Metro Blooms and Blue Thumb is to kind of bring green spaces to as many people as possible. Something that we're trying to notice, we're starting to notice more and more is the importance of environmental justice and bringing green spaces to historically underserved communities and underserved individuals within those communities. So environmental justice is definitely something we're starting to place more and more of an emphasis on. In terms of what we do, it's everything from education to helping folks get plants in the ground to even, working as a contractor directly with residents. So whatever your needs are related to green infrastructure, Metro Blooms and Blue Thumb are there to kind of be your right-hand man in terms of making your projects, your dreams for your yard a reality.
So to put this project in context, James, I am working on dormant seeding a prairie area between my neighbor's house and our driveway. It's just turf area right now that's very highly underutilized, and I want to get prairie plants growing in that area and just want to use that as a context for starting off this conversation about dormant seeding today.
Yeah. Dormant seeding, it's certainly one of my favorite windows to use when I'm trying to think about how I can kind of renovate or, just bring in some new diversity to a planted area. So this can be done either as a complete new lawn renovation where you're taking away the pre-existing vegetation and introducing something new, or you can do this as kind of, mixing in with what you already have. So what I mean by that is if you have a turf lawn that's already healthy and you just want to bring in a different species of grass or maybe incorporate some flowers into that, you can kind of keep what you have in place and start with and just add to your pre-existing lawn. Or you can do this as a full new lawn renovation where you scrap away the old vegetation and you're pretty much starting from scratch. I would say the key to a dormant seeding kind of more broadly is the ability of whatever you're putting down to accumulate degree days. And that's a little bit of, it might sound intimidating, but it's actually a pretty simple concept. So I want to start first by comparing this to a spring seeding. So here in Minnesota, I'm an East Coast boy, so Minnesota winters were a completely new bear for me. And what I found is that spring starts quite a bit later, and you have snow and ice cover for an extended duration of time. That being said, you are starting to get some warm weather while that snow and ice is already on the ground and maybe first starting to melt. So when we get that kind of first hit of warm weather in the spring, the seeds and the plants in the soil bed are able to start accumulating what's called degree days, where degree days are just an accumulation of warmth. And that's really what plants respond to. You've probably noticed that your grass turns green at different times of the year each year, or your flowers kind of have different bloom windows and growth windows each year. And that's because they respond to that accumulation of degree days. They quite frankly don't care if it's April or May, they care about that accumulation of warmth. So in terms of a dormant seeding, Where this is applicable is the weeds that are in that seed bed or whatever plants it is that you want to try and kind of overtake, they start accumulating degree days before you're able to spread that seed or whatever plantings you want to get established in the spring. So those weeds have a head start when you do a spring seeding. Comparatively with the dormant seeding, you're getting the plants on the ground, you're putting that seed down while the ground is not quite frozen, but it's too cold for the plants to germinate. So as the name would indicate, the seed stays dormant throughout the winter. The snow that we get here in Minnesota, it's actually kind of a boost, a boon, as it helps the seed stay in place. And then once the snow starts to melt, once we start to get those warmer spring temperatures, the seed that you've put down is able to kind of start accumulating those degree days, and it doesn't have that competitive disadvantage that your seeds would have if you tried to do a spring seeding. Another little benefit is with all of that snow, all of that ice that we get accumulating here in Minnesota through the winter, the ground will be nice and saturated as that seed is starting to accumulate degree days, and a nice saturated soil bed is really good for plant growth and establishment.
When is the best time to do dormant seeding in Minnesota?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably the most common question I get about conducting a dormant seeding is many people, they want to have a specific date or time window as to when I should do this. Unfortunately for us as Minnesotans, we know that winters and falls here vary quite a bit. So rather than having a specific time of year that I would look for, what you really want to tune into is soil temperatures. And that can sometimes be intimidating to residents. It's not like that's something that gets reported on your daily weather report on the news or from Siri in the morning if you use that as your morning source of weather. But lucky for us, it's one Google search away. So local weather stations are able to report soil temperatures, and what you're going to look for is kind of consistent readings between 40 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit for your 6-inch soil temperatures. I wouldn't do it right away the first day we drop below 45. Temperatures can vary here in Minnesota, and if we get a warm front after that first day of the soil temperatures dipping, that could create a problematic situation for your seed, as it might start to germinate, which is the last thing you want here. You want to make sure that we're in a window where it's certainly cold enough where the seed is going to stay dormant throughout the dormant seeding window. But looking at those soil temperatures is your best bet. I noted that you also brought up the idea of snow cover. If you have the ability to, timing a dormant seeding right before a snow event can be a really good strategy. The snow can actually help to keep your seed in place. So if you're worried about folks walking through your lawn, kind of displacing the seed, perhaps there are still birds in the area that might pick at the seed as well. So timing this in conjunction with a snow event can be a really good strategy.
James, what are some things that people need to do in order to get ready to dormant seed on their property?
Yeah, I truly believe that site preparation is the most important thing to consider when trying to evaluate the potential for success of a dormant seeding. So there's two kind of options where you do this either as an overseeding, where you're seeding into a planted area, or you're doing this as a new site renovation. And I think it's important to kind of be truthful with yourself as to what does my lawn look like? If you have a mostly healthy lawn, that the real key here is that it's kind of free of weeds, then you have a situation where new plants can be established alongside. If you're trying to mix in some low-growing flowers into your turf, you could mix it right in. If you're going for more of kind of a prairie kind of route, larger plants, then you do want to remove the vegetation and kind of start from scratch. But one of the keys here, whether you're doing a new planting renovation or an overseeding, is you do have to ensure that the seed you're putting down has seed-to-soil contact. So if you're doing an overseeding, you don't want to drop your seed into a long, tall stand of turf grass. There are two recommendations that I would have. First is you mow that area as low as your mower will allow, and two, you rake away the clippings. So for an overseeding, that will greatly improve your seed-to-soil contact ratios. In the event that you either want to go with prairie plants or you want to just start from scratch because your lawn is overrun with weeds, then your first step is to remove the pre-existing vegetation and put your seed directly into the soil bed. Doing a light raking is certainly in your best interest. What I try to remind folks is we're not trying to completely submerge the seed. We're trying to kind of get a light dusting of soil over the top of the seed.
Now that people have their soil and their seed bed prepared for seeding, what is the best way to go about getting that seed onto the ground?
Yeah, quite frankly, I've done this both as just, the good old-fashioned way. You put some seed in your hand and you try to spread it out as best you can, as evenly as possible. The recommended strategy, if you want to have kind of even plant density throughout the area, is a hand spreader where you kind of crank it as you walk through the lawn, and it helps to ensure an even distribution of the seeds. I would say that the recommendations on either the seed bag or the seed packet are important to follow. A high-quality seed mix should tell you the density you should be aiming for on a square foot or a per acre basis, and kind of doing your best to make sure you're keeping that in mind as you spread the seed throughout the area.
So with that, it gets really confusing as to how much seed people should be putting down. What's a good rule of thumb for how much seed should go down in an area in order to get it growing well?
So it varies quite a bit from seed mix to seed mix. For me, most of my experience is in turf grass, where you're looking at about 4 to 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. But when it comes to working with native plants, they should list it on your seed packet, and even then there will be some variation. Seeds have a great variation in terms of their size and their weight. So the number of seeds that you get in a packet will differ from species to species. So it's hard to kind of put a catch-all recommendation on that. But whoever you're working with, whatever plant provider, plant vendor you're working with, they should be able to give that recommendation based on the species included in the mix. I would say the most important thing, and quite frankly this applies to a dormant seeding or anytime you're trying to get plants installed, is making sure you know the local environmental conditions you're working with. As you purchase a seed mix or whatever plants you're working with, you should try and get some information as to what conditions are these plants suited for. Do I have full sun plants, part sun plants, shady plants included in this mix? Are they best used in dry, wet, or kind of dry, wet mixed soils? And just trying to match the seed mix you select to the local conditions in your yard area. Something else that's also important to consider, I harp a lot on soil quality, is I genuinely think the best $20 you could spend in all of landscaping is on a soil test, where, especially if you're doing kind of a new lawn renovation, this is a great opportunity to look at your soil and amend it if needed. If your soil's lacking in organic matter, you could add some compost. If your soil is a little compacted, you could run an aerator through it or mix in some sand, engineered soil. And when I say engineered soil, that's a mix of compost and sand. Lots of engineered soils are like 80% sand, 20% compost. That's probably a little bit more detail than you need. But what I would say is two very important things are matching the plants you select to the local environmental conditions in your yard, and two, really getting to know your soil and making sure the plants you select are going to be in tune with the soil that's present in your yard. So I think if you have the means to amend your soil, add some high quality topsoil, black dirt, engineered soil, etc., that's certainly the preferred option. It'll kind of expand the range of plants you're able to consider working with. That being said, there's likely listeners to your show, or just gardeners out there in general, that maybe, their budget is limited. They don't have the ability to bring in the quantity of soil that it would take to amend a low quality soil. What I would say to look for is, if you don't have the means of completely amending your soils, there are plants that are specifically attuned to disturbed soils. So it just means you're going to have to do a little bit more in the research department, but finding plants that are well adapted to disturbed soils can kind of still give you a successful endeavor. For example, purple coneflower, it's like the cockroach of the plant community. It survives any and all conditions. And one of the conditions it really does well in is it can survive and grow and bloom and provide great forage for pollinators in disturbed soils. So it's not to say that you can't have a nice planting in areas with disturbed soils. It just means that the plant list you're working with is a little bit more constricted.
Can you share ways for people to be the most successful with getting a dormant seeding to work in their yard?
Yeah, glad to. I would say, so through my line of work, I do a ton of education. And I would say if there's one theme or one main idea that I try to share with people, it's this idea that you want to match the planting you select with your desired function for your yard. Where there's no doubt that kind of in the grand scheme of things, a native planting is better than a bee lawn, which is better than turf grass, which is better than asphalt or some impervious surface. That being said, I would be out of line to suggest that a family with a bunch of dogs and children that want to use their yard area, it would be irresponsible of me to tell them to convert their entire backyard into a beautiful pollinator prairie because it's better for the environment. Instead, I really do think it's all about finding the right planting for the desired function. So trying to think about what areas do you use in your yard, what areas are mostly for aesthetics, and trying to pick the right planting for the right function. So in the case of you, Brad, you mentioned that you were really zoned in on kind of maximizing the ecological function of your yard. So in that situation, I would say, let's go beyond the bee lawn. Let's go for some native plantings that bring beauty, that have better stormwater infiltration, they capture more stormwater, and of course they provide forage for our pollinators and have all sorts of ramifications up, down, and across food webs. But you gave the example that your next door neighbor runs a preschool. And in that situation, of course we want to let the kids roam and play and have fun. So that could be a really ideal situation for a bee lawn, where a bee lawn, it incorporates low-growing flowers into the lawn area. You can still play on it, walk on it, keep your function the same, while still kind of providing a more eco-friendly solution, where there's forage for pollinators. They're much more low input than the traditional lawn. So if there's one thing that you, your neighbor, and really anyone who's tuning into this show that I would want them to keep in mind, it's try and think about the desired function for your yard and select a planting type that will allow you to maintain that function.
So I totally can't remember what the actual question was that I asked James for this answer, but he's got really good information about bee lawns in here, so I decided to keep this part in.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that we are really in the infancy stage in terms of the development of these bee lawns. A student that came before me, his name is Ian Lane, he was really zoned in on what plants will actually work within a bee lawn. And, he was only able to evaluate so many flowers, and the flowers that we've had success with so far are self-heal, creeping thyme, and Dutch white clover. That being said, there are so many potential possibilities that could work within a lawn area. Pussy toes, calico aster, there's so many species out there that could potentially also work within a yard. Something that I know folks are extremely interested in is the incorporation of more native plants. So I would say what we've got now is a good start, but it's by no means the final solution here. So right now we're recommending that folks mix into their turf grass some creeping thyme, some Dutch white clover, some self-heal. There's a little bit of variation as to the kind of conditions that different plants like. For example, the creeping thyme, it loves a full sun, well-drained soil. The self-heal, it is a little bit pickier. It likes a little bit of soil moisture. It likes a little bit of shade. It can do well in full sun. And the Dutch white clover, not too different from the purple coneflower we mentioned before. The Dutch white clover, you put it down, it's going to establish and bloom and help a lot of pollinators out.
So in my backyard, I've got a lot of clover. I haven't used any weed control in my backyard for probably a decade or so. And I've got a lot of clover. I've got a lot of bulbs that are growing in the ground. I've also got a ton of yarrow. Is that a good plant that could be used?
Yeah, good question. And yarrow is actually one that I was going to mention in terms of plants that should be considered for the possible, expansion of bee lawns, where right now we have a very limited list. I think yarrow is definitely one with the potential to be included in kind of future renditions of a bee lawn. What I would say when I'm considering a plant to use within a bee lawn, I think I'm trying to think of the definition of a naturalized plant versus an invasive plant. So many folks express concern over these non-native plants that we're including, Dutch white clover and creeping thyme. What I try to remind them is two things. One, these plants are considered to be naturalized rather than invasive, where an invasive plant is going to competitively exclude the other plants nearby, and the naturalized plant is a non-native plant that can still co-establish alongside the other plants nearby. So because we're not worried about them outcompeting nearby natives, we don't view it as problematic. Something else that we consider is that if it's going to outcompete something, it's going to be turf grass. And quite frankly, if there's a little bit less turf in your lawn, I don't think I'm going to be crying personally. And I'd hope that most residents, especially our eco-conscious residents, aren't going to be too concerned either. So what I'm trying to think of is how can it co-inhabit with the other plants you're trying to include in your landscape? Where you might want to be a little bit more careful is if the area that you're renovating is directly beside a native planted area, where then we can have a little bit more concern about how aggressive are these species that we're introducing, as the last thing we want is for these plants that we're putting into the lawn to eventually to possibly spread into a native planting and overtake those beautiful native prairie plants that you worked so hard to get in the ground.
All right, now we get into the questions that I really do know were asked in this podcast. These are the quickfire questions that we do at the end of every episode. And the first question that I asked James was, what is your favorite food grown in Minnesota?
Oh, good. Okay. So I know the Honeycrisp apple gets a lot of spotlight. I've got some friends at the University of Minnesota Apple Breeding Lab, and they introduced me to the Sweet Tango, which you can find in stores now. My goodness, a Sweet Tango apple, that's just... few things bring me as much joy as a nice, crisp Sweet Tango apple.
What is your favorite place to visit in all of Minnesota?
My favorite place to visit in Minnesota? Good question. Ooh. I would say that the Gophers have definitely grown on me. You know, I'm an East Coast guy, but coming here for graduate school, I definitely miss a good Gopher game at, I know it used to be called TCF Stadium, but I forget what they changed it to. So I definitely love a good Gopher game. Huntington Bank Field, thank you, yeah. And gosh, I've been to the ARB so many times, the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. Gotta give a shout out there. So yeah, I know you probably only wanted one, but there's two passions in my life. One is football. The other is this kind of more ecologically focused passion. So I got to give a shout out to my two favorites in each kind of my lines of life.
What is essential reading for you?
Ooh, so here I am going to touch in on my East Coast bias here. So when I was a student at the University of Delaware, I was lucky enough to have Douglas Talamy as professor. And if you haven't read his book, Bringing Nature Home, I think it is a tremendous inspiration for anyone that's interested in gardening, in supporting your local ecosystems. It was definitely an eye-opener for me. Douglas Talamy, he's also just got this fantastic writing style where it feels almost like his ability to communicate science is kind of unique, where one of my big pet peeves is I don't find research to always be digestible. But his ability to take his research and turn it into a story and create a narrative that's exciting and fun to read, I think it's extremely unique. Highly recommend Bringing Nature Home, Doug Talamy.
And this last quickfire question that we have is from my daughter, Isla. She is 10 years old, and she asks, if you were a plant, what plant would you be?
If I were a plant, what plant would I be? My goodness, I must say this is the first time I've ever received this question. I love the question. I think I'm going to go with the purple coneflower. When I think of the purple coneflower, I think of adaptable, able to persist through difficult situations. And I think something that I've always tried to do is keep a positive mindset, persevere through all sorts of obstacles. And I think the purple coneflower, bursting through those disturbed soils is a nice example of that. It's the first time I've ever gotten that question. I had about 5 seconds to think of my answer, but that's the best I can do on short notice.
James, thank you so much. We're at the end of our episode and our time here together today, but I would like to just make sure, is there anything that I haven't asked you today that you would like to have our listeners hear?
Yeah, I know you talked about it in one of your previous episodes with Kelly Morrison, but one of the programs that I'm lucky enough to be involved in is Lawns to Legumes. It's all about giving residents the opportunity to plant beautiful native flowers that are good for pollinators. So we are still accepting applications. So if you haven't already, maybe you're a new listener to this great podcast, jump on the Blue Thumb website, apply for some funding from the state, and hopefully we can help you get a pollinator project in the ground.
And can you explain the Lawns to Legumes program for anybody who hasn't listened to episode number 2?
Yeah. So Lawns to Legumes is all about giving residents the opportunity to kind of convert their traditional turfgrass lawn into some pollinator-friendly form of planting. And we recognize that there's a cost associated with these kinds of projects. So the state of Minnesota gives out grants of up to $300 to Minnesota residents to help them get started on this project. We had a pilot phase that ran through actually just October 31st, and the results were were staggering, unbelievable. Where to date, we've seen almost 1.5 million square feet of native pollinator plantings installed just through the individual support part of this project. And what's been just as exciting has been just the overall enthusiasm we see from residents, where even folks that didn't get funding were motivated to put plants in the ground. And this is what motivated our representatives to bring this back for a phase 2. So Lawns to Legumes is back. They've doubled the amount of funding dedicated to this program, so we're able to give grants out to more residents. So if you think that you're interested in starting some sort of pollinator-friendly planting, definitely consider looking into this program. Even if you don't receive funding, there's tons of educational material, workshops, resources, etc. related to this program, where we're definitely trying to help the DIY resident, not just folks who receive money from us. So if you have any interest at all in starting a pollinator-friendly planting, give the program a look.
I've had a couple of questions about the program that I haven't been able to get great answers for yet. Is it possible to get reimbursed for projects that you have already started, or do they need to be only projects looking forward?
So unfortunately, the state is not able to reimburse folks for purchases they made prior to receiving their grant. It's just one of the little intricacies of this program. This is the first state program that I've been involved in, but it is a requirement that purchases be made after receiving the grant. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a ton of fun. Hope I could be back sometime.
See what I mean? Even with the absolute mess that was my audio on this episode for whatever reason, James was just a huge wealth of knowledge, and I hope that I was able to put that back together again for you to make it make sense. And if you have any questions about dormant seeding, I would be more than happy to answer them. You can go in the comment section on our Facebook page or on the post at minnesotagardening.com/9, where you'll be able to find all of the show notes for this episode as well. So this, again, was one of the most timely episodes that we've had of fitting in right when you need to get real good information about gardening here in Minnesota. And with that, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any information as we go forward. So subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts or minnesotagardening.com/podcast. And then the last thing I will ask you today is, as you are at minnesotagardening.com, check out some of the blog posts that we've got on there and subscribe to our email list. You can go to minnesotagardening.com/email and get on that email list, where I send a weekly newsletter with gardening information specific for Minnesota folks. Next week, we have an absolute gem of an episode with Megan Gilger from Fresh Exchange. She's got a wildly popular podcast, and she is just a breath of fresh air. And so we have a Thanksgiving episode that we have all ready for you, talking about giving thanks in your gardens and reflecting on where you've been and where you're going to go in the future. So make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next week.